This is lecture 7 for Biology 178 with Endocrine System 2. In this lecture series, we will focus on the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and thyroid gland functions. The hypothalamus is the first gland that we'll talk about in depth. It is the master control tissue that integrates nervous and endocrine responses together to create the neuroendocrine system. There are three main mechanisms of integration by which the hypothalamus integrates directly with the rest of the endocrine system. It does this through making two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, secreting regulatory hormones. These are going to be hormones that act upon the anterior pituitary gland to produce other hormones, and then containing autonomic centers or neurons that actually connect with the adrenal medulla and cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is a diagram showing you the three methods of integration on how the hypothalamus is going to integrate itself into the endocrine system and exert control. Again, it does this through first synthesizing two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These two hormones are actually going to be made in the hypothalamus and then released into circulation via the posterior pituitary gland, seen here. The hypothalamus also secretes regulatory hormones. These hormones are going to travel into the anterior pituitary gland and cause the release of other hormones. So flipping one switch turns on another switch. Finally, there are autonomic centers within the hypothalamus that integrate directly with the adrenal medulla. These preganglionic motor fibers are going to connect down to the adrenal medulla. They're sympathetic nerve fibers, and they will cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine during sympathetic nervous system response. Now, the hypothalamus is going to directly interconnect with the pituitary gland via a structure called the infundibulum. Inside the infundibulum are going to be capillary networks that interconnect the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland, or the hypophysis. This creates our first portal system that we'll discuss in this class. A portal system is going to be two capillary networks that are connected by individual portal vessels. The purpose of these portal vessels are going to be, in this case, to isolate the flow of hormones and make sure that the hormones are not diluted by circulation in the rest of the blood. So here, regulatory hormones are going to be released from the hypothalamus at the medium eminence of the infundibulum. They move from the interstitial fluid into the capillaries. From here, they are carried to the anterior pituitary gland by the portal vessels, the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vessels, where there is a second capillary network within the anterior pituitary gland. This allows those hormones to reach the target cells without diluting. Here we can see the diagram of these capillary vessels and how we actually get hormones from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary gland and then out to the body. We'll start with the anterior pituitary gland here. First, the superior hypophyseal artery will bring blood into the capillary network that's going to be in the hypothalamus. From here, it will collect the regulatory hormones that the hypothalamus secretes and then transport them via the portal vessels down into the secondary capillary network that is inside the anterior pituitary gland. These portal vessels are ensuring that there is no dilution of those hormones as they transfer from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, so that way they can have maximum effect. We have another capillary network that's going to be in the posterior gland, but notice this just goes artery, capillaries to vein. There's no secondary portal vessels as it doesn't need them. Here, it's just transporting antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin out of the posterior pituitary gland. So those portal vessels are very important in the that are connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, very important in ensuring the direct communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Now, there are two classes of regulatory hormones. They are releasing and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones will stimulate hormone synthesis and secretion, so it turns things on. Example would be thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, or growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. Thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to cause the release of thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary gland. Corticotropin releasing hormone is going to cause the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then growth hormone releasing hormone, I think you can guess what that causes release of. That's right, it's growth hormone. On the flip side, we have inhibiting hormones. These will stop or prevent hormone synthesis and secretion. An example of this is dopamine, which is a prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin itself is going to be produced in order to manufacture milk in females. The second part of the major endocrine glands past the hypothalamus is going to be the pituitary gland, or the hypophysis. It is a small oval gland, roughly the size of a pea. It lies within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It releases 9 peptide-based hormones. 7 of these hormones are released from the anterior lobe, otherwise known as the adenohypophysis. These hormones are all termed tropic. Trope means a turning hormone because they turn on other endocrine glands. You'll see this very commonly throughout a lot of the other glands, is that they are activated by some sort of hormone that is released from the anterior pituitary gland, or adenohypophysis. The other 2 hormones are manufactured by the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary gland, otherwise known as the neurohypophysis, because it is made of neural tissue. So here we can see a simple structure of the pituitary gland and where it sits inside the sella turcica. Notice in this diagram the different appearances of the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior. The posterior is directly linked to the hypothalamus because it is the same tissue as it extends down. The anterior pituitary gland is formed of glandular tissue and secretes far more hormones than the posterior pituitary gland does. The hormones of the anterior pituitary gland are thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, and then melanocyte stimulating hormone. We're now going to go through each one of the hormones that are released from the adenohypophysis, including its function and what triggers its release. The first will be the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This, once released, will activate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. We'll get to the thyroid hormones later, but this just turns on the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. It is released in response to the regulatory hormone released from the hypothalamus called thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. So this pathway is TRH causes the release of TSH, which causes the release of other thyroid hormones. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is also known as corticotropin. This, as a tropic hormone, will stimulate the release of steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex, specifically those that affect glucose metabolism, like cortisol. It is released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, from the hypothalamus. So again, the pathway for this is the hypothalamus releases CRH, which causes the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland, which will thereby cause the release of cortisol in the adrenal cortex. We'll get to that one later as well. Next will be gonadotropins. There are 2 types here. Gonadotropins in general will regulate the activity of the gonads, which are the testes in males and ovaries in females. They are released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, from the hypothalamus. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to promote ovarian follicle development and estrogen secretion in females and sperm maturation in males. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, promotes ovulation in females, which is, of course, the release of the egg or the ova from the actual ovary, and sex steroid production in both sexes, so progesterone, estrogen, as well as testosterone in males. Growth hormone is something that a lot of people are aware of, and it stimulates cell growth and reproduction by accelerating the rate of protein synthesis. It is regulated by two hypothalamic hormones: growth hormone releasing hormone, which turns growth hormone on, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which turns it off. The direct actions of growth hormone involve the stimulation of stem cells to divide and grow, specifically in epithelial and connective tissues. It's going to cause the breakdown of adipose tissue, releasing fatty acids into the blood, and stimulate the breakdown of glycogen reserves to release glucose into the bloodstream. The breakdown of fats and of glycogen reserves is to make more energy available to be able to build more tissue. Since we're already increasing the rate of stem cell division of connective tissue and epithelial tissue, we are going to need more energy to do more building. The later effects are going to be increasing rate of protein synthesis. So this, of course, is going to cause increased growth of different muscle cells and not just the bone itself. Prolactin in its natural form is going to stimulate milk production by the mammary glands in pregnancy and nursing periods, and it works with other hormones to stimulate mammary gland development, things like estrogen, progesterone, where these start to develop over time. In men, we are not sure what prolactin does upon its release. From the anterior pituitary gland lobe, we need to move to the posterior pituitary gland lobe. Here, there are two hormones that are released: antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These are both made in the hypothalamus. Antidiuretic hormone is otherwise known as ADH or vasopressin. Its primary function is to act on the kidneys to retain water and decrease urination. It also is a powerful vasoconstrictor that helps to increase blood pressure. We'll talk more about the direct actions of antidiuretic hormone when we get to the urinary system. Oxytocin has a few different effects. It stimulates smooth muscle contractions in the walls of the uterus, promoting labor and delivery. It's one of the few examples we have of a positive feedback mechanism in the body. The contraction of the myoepithelial cells in the mammary glands are also stimulated by oxytocin as well. This promotes the letdown or ejection reflex of milk. It also has unclear functions in sexual activity, but circulating levels of oxytocin rise during sexual arousal. We believe this might even be a hormone that is directly related to attraction or even love. So here's a diagram showing you the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland. It's giving you everything laid out in a nice flow chart. We can see the hypothalamus, all of the different regulating hormones or the different regulatory hormones that it releases and how they act upon the anterior pituitary gland to release or stop the release of another hormone. Additionally, in this diagram, you can see how, for example, corticotropin releasing hormone is going to activate ACTH, which will act upon the adrenal cortex to produce glucocorticoids, the different steroid hormones. So it's giving you this kind of pathway on how one hormone will affect another hormone. You can also see the direct hormone release of sensory stimulation and osmoreceptor stimulation in the posterior pituitary gland and how that affects ADH or oxytocin release as well. We will now move on to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located just below the thyroid cartilage, otherwise known as the Adam's apple in the throat. And the thyroid gland produces two related hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, so T4 and T3, as well as another hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to help regulate blood calcium levels, whereas thyroxine and triiodothyronine are going to help to deal with metabolism. The thyroid gland itself is composed of two lobes connected by a narrow isthmus. It has an extensive blood supply, and this gives it a deep red color. Here we can see the thyroid gland where it connects in just below the thyroid cartilage, and it has an extensive blood supply, including its own artery and vein that will connect directly into it from the carotid and jugular veins, from the carotid artery and jugular veins. From a histological perspective, the thyroid gland contains a large number of follicles. follicles are hollow spheres that are lined by a simple cuboidal epithelium, and each follicle cavity holds a viscous colloid. Colloid is a fluid packed with dissolved proteins. Into that colloid follicle, cells secrete a globular protein called thyroglobulin. So the colloid itself is filled with thyroglobulin. This is a molecule containing the amino acid known as tyrosine. Tyrosine is important because it is the building block of thyroid hormones. So each one of these thyroid follicles is going to be packed with proteins that form the building blocks for the hormones that they make. A network of capillaries is going to also surround each follicle that helps to transport nutrients, wastes, and other secretory products. Besides just the thyroid follicles, we also have the C cells or clear cells. These are found between the basement membranes of follicle cells, so they'll be between the actual follicles themselves. They secrete a hormone called calcitonin, abbreviated CT. Calcitonin will help to regulate calcium ion concentrations in body fluids. So here we can see a great example of the thyroid follicle as we can see this cross section of the thyroid gland. Note the follicle itself appears very smooth. Remember, this follicle is composed of thyroglobulin that is inside that colloid fluid. From there, it is surrounded by simple cuboidal cells and then different capillaries that would be around that. You can also take note of in between follicles will be the C cells where calcitonin is made. So the primary function of the follicle is going to be to produce thyroid hormone. It does this through the amino acid tyrosine, which contains iodine. Iodine is actually only used in our body to make thyroid hormone. How does this happen? Well, it starts with the iodide ions from our diet that are delivered to the thyroid gland and taken up by the follicle cells. From here, enzymes will convert these iodide ions to iodine atoms and attach them to tyrosine portions of thyroglobulin molecules. So it's going to merge it with the thyroglobulin. From here, T4 and T3 are going to be produced and stored in the thyroglobulin. Thyroxine is called T4 because it is produced with 4 iodines, whereas triiodothyronine is produced with 3. Follicle cells will then remove the thyroglobulin from the follicle by endocytosis, removing it from the cell. From here, enzymes will break down thyroglobulin, releasing the thyroid hormone. T4 makes up about 90% of the thyroid secretions, whereas T3 is less than 10%. These are then transported across the basement membrane and enter the bloodstream. So this is a diagram of the follicle cavity, the follicle cell, and the capillary that is inside the thyroid gland. We're looking at just a single one, but all of these perform the same function. These will be initiated, and this whole process is initiated by thyroid stimulating hormone. This TSH is going to activate a TSH sensitive ion pump that we can see at the start arrow. Here, this pump will pump iodide ions into the cytoplasm of the follicle cell. So it'll keep moving through diffusion and convert to iodine atoms. These will thereby connect with the tyrosine portion of thyroglobulin. This is a storage form of sorts for thyroid hormones. As thyroid hormones are needed, the iodinated thyroglobulin is transported back into the follicle cell where enzymes are going to clip off to form subunits of T3, which is triiodothyronine, and T4, thyroxine. We make about 90% T4 and about 10% T3. From here, these are then going to be transported back into the blood while the thyroglobulin is broken back off and recycled into the follicle cavity. Now, about 75% of T4 and about 70% of T3 molecules are transported in the blood via thyroid binding globulins. The hormones here are released from the proteins gradually so we can control its release throughout the body, and they're not just released all at once. Your bloodstream is going to, on average, contain about a 1-week reserve supply of T4 and T3 to regulate metabolic function. So once thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, are traveling in the blood and they get released from those proteins and act upon a cell, these are the effects that they would have on that tissue. 1, an increased rate of oxygen consumption and energy consumption. In children, this can cause a rise in body temperature, which is often why one of the major stimulating factors of thyroid stimulating hormone and subsequently T4 and T3 release is going to be temperature of the external environment. If it's colder, you will release more T3 and T4 in your body. Number 2, increased heart rate and force of contraction. Generally, this also results in a rise in blood pressure. Number 3, an increased sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. That is, your fight or flight system can activate more easily. Number 4, maintenance of normal sensitivity of respiratory centers to changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations. So despite other variables, it is able to maintain this sensitivity to gas changes. Number 5, stimulation of red blood cell formation and thus enhanced oxygen delivery. We are actually making more red blood cells the more thyroid hormone we make. Stimulation of activity in other endocrine tissues. So other endocrine cells are going to start secreting more rapidly their hormones to increase the overall metabolic function, which is the sum of all chemical reactions in your body. And finally, there's an accelerated turnover of minerals in bone that is caused by thyroid hormones. This is going to cause calcium to be released and reabsorbed more rapidly and increasing its rate of reformatting the bone itself. So as I've said before, the thyroid hormone is a classical negative feedback loop with how it actually works. The production of thyroid hormone is controlled by the hypothalamic pituitary system that we discussed earlier. Specifically, it is regulated by the release of thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, that is made from the hypothalamus. From here, we get initially stimulated by something in the body. In this case, cold exposure that would act upon the body, thus stimulating the hypothalamus to produce TRH. TRH will then act upon the anterior pituitary gland to produce thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will travel down to the thyroid gland and stimulate the follicle cells of the thyroid gland to enlarge and increase production of thyroid hormones. So the thyroid gland would thereby make T3 and T4. These are the thyroid hormones. This would cause an increase in body temperature as one of its effects. Once that body temperature rises sufficiently enough, it will stop that initial exposure to cold feeling that was felt by the hypothalamus and turn it off. So it turns off the TRH, which will turn off the TSH, which will turn off the thyroid hormones, only once that desired temperature has been reached. So this, you can see, is going to be the classic negative feedback loop. Now we're going to break that loop. If we break that loop and we don't have enough iodine in our diet, we are not able to manufacture thyroid hormones effectively. So because of this, maybe we still have that cold sensation, the hypothalamus will make TRH, which will make TSH by the anterior pituitary gland, which will then try to make T3 and T4. But with no iodine present in the diet, it's not going to be able to actually make the T3 and T4, and therefore the initial stimulus that caused the release of TRH is still there. So because of this, there's going to be an enlargement of the thyroid gland as more thyroid stimulating hormone is sent down to the thyroid gland. This is called goiters. It's usually associated with a thyroid hyposecretion due to a nutritional iodine deficiency. It can also result from an autoimmune attack on the thyroid gland. We call this Graves' disease. Goiters is something that was it's seen typically in a lot of third world countries or people that are very malnourished, but it was seen throughout the 1940s and into the 50s here in the US. And this was due to an increase in processed food consumption and a decrease of iodine consumption. So because of this, the government actually started issuing iodized salt. So people would salt their food and consume more iodine, thus goiters was solved. And here we can see the after effects of goiters, a very enlarged thyroid gland that would actually cause this kind of, it's a hypertrophy of the thyroid gland that we call goiters. The final thing that we'll talk about will just be finishing up with the thyroid gland. This is the parathyroid gland. This is going to be two pairs of embedded glands on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. All four glands together weigh about 1.6 grams or 0.06 ounces. So here we can see the parathyroid glands on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid glands have chief cells on them. These produce parathyroid hormone, which is the only hormone made by the parathyroid gland. Its function is to increase the calcium levels in your body. It does this by monitoring calcium levels in the blood like the thyroid C cells do. From here, when calcium cells fall below normal, parathyroid hormone will be released. This causes an increase in calcium levels. We talked about parathyroid hormone in much greater depth in the skeletal system, but effectively what it does is going to stimulate osteoclast activity to break down bone structure and release it into the body. It also will increase the absorption of calcium from your intestines and your kidneys. Here we can actually see the dense fibrous capsule that separates the cells of the parathyroid gland from those of the thyroid gland tissue and the thyroid follicles. And this area is actually, with the blood vessel in the center, would be the parathyroid gland. On the outside with all the follicles that look like bubbles, that's going to be the thyroid gland. Zooming in on the thyroid cells itself, we can see the parathyroid sheath cells, and there's a lot of them. Those are going to be actually what would secrete parathyroid hormone. Calcium homeostasis in the body is actually going to be a balance between parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Remember, calcitonin is going to be made from the thyroid gland. So parathyroid hormone itself is going to try to increase calcium levels in the blood. It does this by breaking down bone. Calcitonin actually tries to reduce calcium levels in the blood. It does this by actually storing calcium and reducing its absorption. In healthy adults, these two hormones will be the primary regulators of calcium concentration in the body, and they work antagonistically.